All right, maybe this will work. I don't know. Can I share a link to this thing somehow? All right. All right, I'm seeing some people get on. Maybe it is working. Maybe. I don't know. Awesome. Um, all right, let's get a feel for what this delay looks like. Let me ask a question, something simple, and you guys can just answer real quickly, and that'll just give me a feel for how long of a delay we've got right now. What should I ask? What's your favorite sport or video game, if you prefer a video game? Okay, that was fast. Good. Good. That was way less delay than they said we were going to have. All right. They were saying we would have like 20 plus seconds at least, but definitely faster. All right. I guess we'll get going. I hope this will work and create a video as well, like we're used to having. We'll see. I had to change stuff up because they killed Google Hangouts at the end of July, and they don't have any other way to do streaming from inside of YouTube directly that shares your screen. So I had to try and hunt down some setup. So, Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy IV. Good calls. I haven't played them. My friends love them. I know I should play them. I own like Chrono Trigger, probably on multiple platforms, but all right. So first things first, I didn't get anything out for you guys on Thursday or Saturday. I am incredibly sorry for that. I have no excuse. Just took my laptop to get some stuff out on Thursday or when I headed out on Wednesday and just got swamped with, being away and having fun and hanging out with my friends. So I didn't actually post anything. Given that, I still don't want to extend the class and have people have to go longer than they would or were planning. And I'm going to be going on Saturday, so Thursday is going to be the last official class for this React course. Given all of that, but I will try and make up for that a little bit by getting you guys some follow-up content, structured stuff for you to work through even after the official class is done that you can continue to build on and work through. And I may even work through that with you. Maybe even, spending some evenings at like the Code to Dream at the Frontier or something, doing some work just there in case people want to talk and ask questions. So again, sorry that I got you nothing for Thursday and Saturday. That's just 100% on me. Also, that means, hey, guess what? I don't have a lot prepped for today, but I think we can do what I wanted to talk about today sort of freehand anyways, because it's going to, it would be nice to have some slides to emphasize some of these things, but Gizmo leave you anything to do? Did not. Neither did I. So I think what I wanted to talk about today was how can you style a React application, right? How do you do styling? Because it's a little different than what you're used to Not necessarily all of it's React that makes it different, but just the general approach of how any of it works is a little different than what you might be used to. So we can start with one of our existing applications that we have, something very simple if you want, and we can do some styling on top of that to add some complexity or some styling of whatever variety we want. And I'll start with something simple, where relatively, we'll just start with, I don't know if I need that open there, but let's do this clock that we've been working, right? From our last actual class. And I'll start this thing up. And, oh, is it still running somewhere else? All right, let me see what's running. Oh, I still have it running over here. All right, well, let's see if I can just go there. Maybe. Ah, there we go. All right. So right now, we're not applying any special styling to anything on here. If we went up and looked, if you haven't played around with your dev tools enough to be able to do this, I really recommend just spending more time in it all the time, sort of learning how they work. But if we go up and look at this item, oh yeah, I'm going to get rid of all these lifecycle messages so that they're not cluttering stuff up as well. So we talked a lot about that last time. I don't really need those here. Simplify the code a fair bit. There we go. And that should, I think, get rid of pretty much all of them. Get rid of that. That. There we go. Close that. So let's see. So if we highlight any of this, and I'm going to close the console down here. This stuff's zoomed in a little too much for my usual layout. I prefer the side-by-side that it gives me. So I know this is going to be small on some of your screens. I apologize for that, but I just think it's a lot easier when you're trying to see this. And if we look, we don't have much style coming in here, although we do still have this .app class being applied, and there is some styling coming from that. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. I think that's where we'll start talking about styling. And then we'll build off of that into some of the other approaches. I won't give you probably some of the more advanced or complicated ones that require a lot more JavaScript strength, or at least we won't dive into it as much. I might touch on them near the end. But those are all built on one of a few different major options for how to do this. And this is, like I said, this is also going to introduce some of this Webpack and what Webpack does for you, which is a really cool thing. So we're not applying any special styling in this clock element or even on these buttons that we have. So let's start and say, well, we really want these buttons to look cooler. You know, we want to give them some styling that's that just makes them larger, gives them some punch or some pizzazz. Or maybe we want the whole thing to just be bigger, right? Like I've zoomed in like this before, but we want the whole application to be larger. So you can always, I'll go over here to this app.js. You can always use classic CSS styling when you're styling an application in React. That means you can create CSS files and you can leverage them just like you would anywhere else. But even in this application, we're not really using this file the same way we would elsewhere. And there's a lot of stuff in here I can get rid of because we're not using it, because I deleted all that stuff. So let's get rid of all that. This is really all we have right now, this really minor bit. And this is just like any other CSS file. It's, you know, just this it's got an .app class selector, and it's applying some styling. And then if we want to set some, you know, we could do, let's set the size of the default of this to, we'll make it a lot larger than normal, like 24 pixels, let's say. And we go back and look, we might need to refresh this. Oh, it might not actually pick it up. Let's see. Oh, it does have it. All right, let me see. I thought it was just size, but I could be wrong. Is it font size? All right, it's font size. So let's set the font size to 24 pixels. And what we see is it changed over here, right? We got this larger font. That's awesome. But how does that actually, my other computer's like crashing on me here. How does that actually get used? Because traditionally, the way that you would use a CSS file like this is you would go to, say, your index.html file, something like this, and you would add a reference to it. But if you look here, we'll see that there's no reference to this app.css file anywhere in our index file, our HTML file. And if that's the case, how are we actually getting this styling into our application? Where does it go from this CSS file into the application? Well, let's go back over here and let's see if we can look at where it says it comes from right now. So if we click into this, we can see, oh wow, it's actually inlined right here. Now that's React doing some magic, or React and Webpack doing a little more magic, because older versions of this may, or other versions, or if your file's a lot larger, might not inline it. They may import a standalone CSS file still. But you notice, here's this text CSS, here's this styling. We never put that stuff into the index.html. In fact, where is it at? Let's see if I can compare it. It's right at the bottom of the head. If we go over here and look, there's nothing there, right? Here we have a title React app. That's before all of this stuff. So how is it actually getting into our web page? How is it getting into that HTML? And that gets into this really nice aspect of working with Webpack, which is if we go over and look at our app.js file, and let's collapse it all. Here we're importing a CSS file into our JavaScript file. Now, this is sort of important to catch, right? This is not, I'll reiterate that just by even typing it out so it's clear, right? Like, this is not valid JavaScript. You can't actually import CSS into a JavaScript file like that, at least not in the JavaScript spec for modules and importing. That's not what's supported at all. But Webpack lets you do that. And Webpack lets you treat a lot of these other resources that you're used to working with on a web page. So think of images, that you frequently have to import into your web page, or CSS files, or fonts, these types of resources that you have to sort of embed in your HTML and then you're referencing in your JavaScript, but there's no direct connection between them. Like if it didn't load in the HTML or you didn't have that reference, you wouldn't really know. Well, now Webpack lets you treat those like they're just JavaScript modules or a module being imported. And I'll get to Webpack in a second. Good question, good question. And what it's going to do is a whole bunch of work behind the scenes to put this, to take that CSS and inline it here. Right? Now, the nice part about that is you get this when this is supported because we used Create React App. It sets all of this stuff up for you. It does all of your Webpack logic and all this other stuff. And we haven't really gotten into Webpack that much, maybe touched on it a hair. So I'll make sure I come back to it. I appreciate you asking that. And if we go, I'll really dive into it a little bit later. I'll save that for after we've talked about the different styling approaches in React so that I'm not intermingling too much about them. But basically, Webpack Let me go look at their definition. Their documentation is horrible. Their definition's always been very vague and not very readable. So let's see if it's any better now. It just says it's a module bundler. Let me see here. If we go to their documentation, will give me something. Webpack is a static module bundler for modern JavaScript applications. You might think of it, if you've worked with other programming languages, like your compiler in a sense. Webpack is this layer in a JavaScript application, if you're using it, that lets you use things that the browser doesn't yet support. For example, imports or newer JavaScript syntax. And one of the steps that Webpack will do, basically Webpack is a tool that calls a whole bunch of other tools to accomplish things for you. So one of the things that it calls, and we've talked about that before, is it calls Babel, right? We've looked at the Babel.js website and said this will translate newer JavaScript into older JavaScript so your browser can support it. Well, that's something that Webpack can sort of wrap for you, so you don't necessarily have to do that, set all that up directly. And then it can also do some of this importing of CSS, etc. Now, I'd say for the most part, especially when you're just getting started with working with React or anything like that, don't dive down into the details of Webpack. They're hairy, they're complicated, they're tricky, but do rely on Create React App or any other tooling. I prefer Create React App because it's sort of official, that will facilitate creating your application with the right settings so that you can work with them. It's just so much easier if you don't have to go down into tinkering with this. And I'll highlight that, later on in class when I show you what happens when we eject the application. So right now, if we look at our scripts, right, we've got start, build, test, and eject. Now what we're doing right now is start. Let me show you really quickly what happens when you run a build command. And these came from Create React App. It set these up for us. So I'm gonna have to shut down my server here for a minute, and I can do npm run build. And this will produce something that's just a little different than our start, because when we did start, it's actually starting a web server for us that runs constantly and lets us dynamically update our code and see the changes, which is awesome. But when we do a build, there it's actually, and now I'm just going to start back up again so that we're running. When we do a build, what you should see now is, I don't need you, I already have one open. All right. What we should see is this new build folder. And this would be if you were actually taking your React application and you're going to actually serve it up to somebody else. You want to put this on a web page and have people use it. You're going to run the build that comes with it. And it bundles up pretty much everything you need, including a list of static files, like a CSS file and a JavaScript file. And there's a whole bunch of weird stuff in here that for the most part you shouldn't need to worry about. But if we go look at our CSS, we'll see here's one thing. All right, here's our app style. That's our app CSS file. But Webpack, without us having to know what we were really doing there, took all of the different CSS files that we have, packaged them together into this one, or concatenated them together, dealt with any of the complexity, and then gave it this unique name for our running application to use. So then how does that actually get used? Well, if we go and look at the HTML file, and I'll format this so it's easier to see. Now we can see that here's a link loading our CSS. So when you do an actual build, it produces something a little closer to what you're used to seeing. But if you went and tried to look at these chunks, these are your actual bits of code, including all the React code packaged together. It's not readable at all. And that's because when you're doing production level stuff, you're going for performance. You're not trying to make your code readable. You want to be as fast as possible. I'm not going to save that formatting. So we're going to come back to talking about a little bit more of the Webpack bit and how that works under the covers at the end of this class. Is it language or browser specific for Webpack? Is a good question. Webpack is pretty much a JavaScript build tool or a front-end web build tool. So it's used for pretty much just front-end web stuff. It has plugins that can support all the different languages on front end. So for example, there's another language that is a superset of JavaScript that adds typing. It's called TypeScript to JavaScript. You can use Webpack to build TypeScript applications. You just have to put some plugins into it. And that's also how it supports like CSS and different images and stuff like that. Is it's got different plugins to help it recognize what these different things are and how to work with them. But getting back off of there for a minute, let's talk about this styling, right? So notice here, it's just importing this file. It doesn't actually use a from, and that's because we can't really reference a style sheet the same way that you can a component. So this import is basically just saying, make sure this style sheet is included on this page. And then any styling from that is going to apply based off your standard CSS rules. So here we've got a .app selector, and of course in here, if we look at our application, we're putting an app class name on here. So that's why we're getting styling when we look at that individual thing. It's sort of coming from this standalone CSS file that is combined into this app.js. So let me open up a notepad here. I'll move it to the side, and we'll just take some notes using this today. This is Markdown. I mean, you could also just use CSS files like you are used to and link them in the HTML directly. That's perfectly valid. I'm not going to show that example just because it requires me to do a little bit more work to get that set up. But that's a perfectly valid way to do some styling. Now, one thing, even when we're using CSS files like that, a lot of times in React applications, you'll notice, for example, here, this is an app.css file, and this is app.js, right? So the style sheet a lot of times will still be sort of connected to the component that you are doing the styling for. And so in order to emphasize that a little more, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these buttons that we have, and even though this seems a little redundant at first, I think you'll hopefully see some of the value here. And I'm going to just go create another component out here, which is a button.js file, because I'm a lazy person. Though it's going to take me longer to delete everything than what I needed. Let me get rid of all this. And this is going to be a button, which extends a React component. Now, in reality, I don't need any of this stuff because my button is very, very simple. And this might not even be a class component. We'll see in a minute. We're going to export the button. I don't care about any of that. Yeah, I think this is going to end up being a functional component. So let me try that. Button. And then I don't need this render if it's a functional component. It's just going to return from there. Get rid of this low indentation. Oops, I keep wanting to put an M. And then what this is going to, I'm going to want out of here is just a button to be returned. But it needs to take some parameters, which means props, in order for it to be functional as a replacement for our existing one. And what we're going to want it to take is an onClick. So we'll just do props.onClick and assume that we're passing in an onClick property. And we're going to want it to take some children. So it will render whatever gets passed as a children right here. And all it's doing is returning this HTML button component, right? Or element. So I don't have anything super complex in here right now. But what I can do now is go up here, import this button. And then get rid of again, hide some of this stuff. Don't care about these details. I'm going to switch this. It's going to be very, very easy for me to change because really all I did was uppercase my button element. So I have an uppercase thing called a button instead now. And I'm already passing in an onClick to it. And I'm already passing in children. So let's see if that worked. Swing back over here. And now let's look at what do we have for React elements. Connect to React, it should see an app. And then we've got, yep, actual button elements rendered here. So that was very trivial, right? I didn't do much to create this component, but I think you'll see, I'm doing it so that you'll be able to see different approaches to styling, and I pulled it out because a lot of times you really want things to stand alone and be reusable this way. So now let's say, oh man, we really want to change the way buttons are styled. These are simple, they're not the size we want to add some complexity, right? So let's go back to this app.css or app.js, and let's follow the same pattern we had here, which is I'm going to import, going to create a button.css file. Oops, didn't need all that. And that's going to contain my styling for my button components. Now, right now, this should create an error because it can't find the button.css that I just tried to reference. So here I need to create it. I should fix my error, hopefully. Oh, there we go. Nothing changed. And now I could just do styling like what we're used to. I'm gonna do some styling in just a moment. I want to pause and take a look at some of the comments. I've seen a fair bit here. Does the life cycle affect the styling at all? I.e., do you have to set styles according to which life cycle is using them? Usually the life cycle is unconnected to the styling at all because styling is used by the element and not by the life cycle. Styling is just about what gets rendered in the browser. How do you recognize what the children are? Yeah, we've talked about that a little bit, but it's definitely one that you sort of learn, which is as you work, anything that is inside of the actual tags for your element are children. So in this case, this toggle clock text becomes the children. But we could put other stuff in here inside of this button. I don't know what all is allowed. Let's see. Probably not a paragraph, but let's see if it yells at me. How much can I put inside a button element? Maybe it let me put that there. No, there we go. Look, it turned into this big old huge ugly paragraph thing that doesn't look right or act right, really. You know, I could put other stuff in there, and everything, basically everything between there and there are your children. And so it's just a really easy way to compose components, because that way we've been able to create this reusable button element, which didn't have to have the hard-coded text for the buttons, and we can just create buttons putting extra text in as we want, right? No challenge, there are no real problem with that at all. All right, let's clean that up a little bit. Hopefully that answered that. Let me take a look here again. Is it attached to the parent, which is also in a tag? I mean, the children are attached, but not in any more complex way, I would say. If you had a link within the button tags, yes, that would also be a child. Yep, exactly. All right. So now let's go ahead and do some styling, right? We've got a button CS, but we need to do one more thing to connect them up the way that we're doing it right now, which is this button needs to have some sort of class or some way to refer to it, right? We could, I guess we could just do this. Let's see if it works. We could just refer to styling on button elements like that and add some styling. I don't know what to say. Let's give them a height or a minimum height of like 50 pixels and a min width of like 100 pixels. So let's see if that works. All right, I don't know if that worked. Might have something wrong right now. I need to go. Code seems to be okay. Oh, there we go. Well, that works. I guess the min height, min width bit didn't work. Interesting. Probably because they're rendering the wrong way. And that gets into a lot of little styling bits. That was weird, setting the height and width. Gave it this gray background. I don't quite understand why. It looks like some styling defaults from Chrome are doing some of that. It does bother me a little. I thought min height and min width would work. Let me try this. Let me get rid of the height here first before I do that. Ah, I didn't get rid of it. Dang it. Delete you. There we go. I'm just going through different ways to show these things. All right. I see, I think. It actually is giving them a min height of the height specified. I believe, oh, maybe not. No. Width times height. No, I don't know why it's not applying that. So let's try and use a class selector, because typically you would want to do that anyways. Because that way you get to be more specific, right? And in this case, you know, we could say, I don't know, we could just use a class selector of button. We could say like clickable button if we wanted. It doesn't really matter, right? What we want to call the class on this. So let's do button. And I know that's, again, maybe it's seeming a little silly. Okay, why didn't we just style the default button element? Yeah, it is not accepting a min height and min width, that's for sure. I sure thought they would. I feel like there's something else wrong here. Maybe button isn't really a valid element. I don't know. But we can start changing some of this, right? Here we can now apply like a font size to the text inside of here. All right, we want the font in our buttons to be 20 pixels or something, right? And we go, look, we should now have larger buttons. Yeah, I know width and height would work. I was just expecting the other one to work too. So this gets to also why I applied this class here instead of just using the default, the element selector. And that's because ties into the question being asked there. It really is good practice when you're using this approach to have a separate CSS file for each component. And then make your selectors specific enough that they're not going to apply to other React components. That way, you're creating this one-to-one relationship component to styling. Now, that doesn't mean that you might have some common application styling in a shared CSS file. And I want to be careful when I say shared, in a common CSS file, because just because these files are separate files doesn't mean that they're separate when they're in the browser, right? It acts like any other CSS in the browser, which is that it doesn't know that it came from file A or file B. It just looks at all the selectors collectively. But the key here is you can create a CSS file and apply styling, like let's around the edges. It's really weird to me that this background took off like that. So let's see what we can do about some of that, right? Let's say I want to give it a proper, we do have an edge, but I want to round the edges. I don't remember the exact CSS syntax to do that. Let's see if I can search it up. Border radius, that's right. This is what's going to apply some curve around it, right? So if I do like a border radius of let's do a border radius of like, I don't know, 25%. Let's see what that does. Whoa, that's way too much. Way too weird. All right, let's try a border radius of like 5 pixels. Let's see what happens. Oh, there we go. We got some nice rounded edges. Getting some of the styling that we want, right? And following this approach should be very, very familiar. It should feel comfortable. It should feel like what you're already used to doing. Nothing strange about it other than the fact that you're creating separate CSS files for each component typically, and you're importing them into your JavaScript. What do we have here? By having a CSS file titled the same as your component, does it mean that styles applicable for that component will only be applied to that component? No, it does not. It does not mean any of that. It's just a way of creating that connection and that relationship in your mind that they're standalone components and you're trying to keep them separate. That, in my mind, is one of the drawbacks to this approach. Is if you are going for a standalone component model like React, I would say basically like encourages using separate CSS files can conflict with that, right? And it can conflict with it because if we go back and look at what we have here, here's our button.css. There's nothing that says, oh, in this app.css, I could go back and create some styling for our standard button again. and make our background, let's make it purple. And there we got our styling, blah, right? It's very easy for that to happen. And it's not as blatantly obvious as what I just did, where it's like the button here. But maybe you're like, oh, but that selector is really easy to reuse. I'll pull it over here and use it in this place because I've already written it. And that way I just have to apply a class, which can work, but you can end up with coupling that you didn't expect or styling coming from places that you weren't looking for. It's very easy for that to happen when you're creating these separate CSS files. And I'm not criticizing this approach. I've taken this approach on pretty much both of the projects that major React applications I've done at work. We went down an approach like this. The first one, mainly because of needing to work with the existing styling around the application. And the second one, because I was working with a group of people who felt much more comfortable with this type of approach. And so it worked best for us. But we did still have problems that sprang up as a result of going down this path, where styling was being affected in ways that were unexpected. So let's talk about the other major, like I'm going to talk about it as an umbrella concept here for styling React applications, and then maybe I'll touch on some of the tooling that helps support this, right? The umbrella concept, the higher level umbrella idea is, why should I, if I really want this component to be standalone and to not let other stuff interfere, why not just inline my styling? And if I want to do that, I could do that in a lot of different ways. The simplest would be something just like this, right? I'm just literally creating a style, except this is going to be an object literal in JavaScript. And so it's going to be smart enough to translate some of this from object literal syntax to what works for styling. So we need to do a few changes. We need to take it, we need to put some quotes around things. We need to camel case our styling instead of dashing it, which is what CSS actually supports. And now we've got a style object that's very similar or pretty much the same as what we had before. And we can just put that right here. We can say, oh, the actual style of this button is a reference to this style object. And there we go, we've got it. Works really well for the most part. Some of the benefits you get from this type of approach, right, is, well, now it's very encapsulated. It's obvious that this style only applies to these buttons because we're inlining it on the button. It cannot possibly apply elsewhere. There's no other way for it to apply. And if we want to do this, it doesn't have to live inside the function or component either. A lot of people will do something like this where they'll have their styling live outside of the component and then just refer to it in it. And that way, you still have a little bit of separation. Your styling is living up here, sort of separate. You're loading it, referencing it in your component, and you have it all in that one file, sort of nice and neat together. Again, if you're familiar with traditional web dev frameworks, you're probably thinking, nice and neat together, this is horrible. It takes a bit of time to get used to this paradigm shift, but I've become a big fan of it over time. And you can do a lot of styling this way. And in fact, some places will pretty much only do styling using this sort of inline style approach, where they're just creating all the styling, putting it right on their components directly, etc. And this is what I would say is like the second major paradigm, right? Is use inline styling contained within the same file as the components. So that's the second large-scale major approach that exists for styling a React application. And then we're going to get into, in just a second, some of the problems that this approach also has. And And then there's frameworks that can help solve some of that. And there's over 100 different ways to do styling in React applications. So there's no like, this is the only way to do it. But we'll touch on that in just a second. Let me take a look again and see if there's anything else I'm missing over here. Questions? Do you have to have a separate line when you list multiples? I can't remember the syntax for import for a JS file. You do a separate line for each one. You can only import, you can import multiple, like if you were importing JavaScript things from a module, you can have multiple, for example, named imports from one other file on the same line, but you can't have multiple files on the same line, at least as far as I know it. Could be wrong there, but as far as I know, you can't do multiple files importing on the same line. So we're not using this button.css right now. We've inlined our styling instead, right? And we can do, let's add something else. I don't know. Anyone have some other style they want to apply to this button? Maybe we're going to give it a different font than what we have right now. Oops, I need to make sure I have my comma here. Maybe for these, they have, what fonts are built into, let's just say serif. I don't know what's going to be the default here. Let's see if that works. All right, it did not, so let me play with it for a minute. Figure out how to get it working. Oh, is it font family? Might be font family. So let me try it here and see if I can get it. Now let's do cursive. Let's do fantasy. I just got back from Gen Con. So let's do fantasy. Oh, see, I wrote it wrong here. I need to do camel case. Hey, there we go. Now we've got some different styling there for our buttons. We've changed the way they look a little bit. All right, let me take a look again. So if you have 30 components, you'd have to have 30 lines linking each of your CSS files. You would have one in each one. And that's that idea of keeping stuff independent, right? Unless you use the inline, yeah, if you use inline styling, you wouldn't necessarily do that. But you wouldn't have 30 lines all in app.js. What you do is you put those imports in the component that they're connected to. So like button.css is imported in button.js. And app.css is imported in app.js. And that's so that you're creating that binding, that connection, right? There's nothing else that really forces that binding or connection. All right, so has anybody done any hover styling or anything like that? Styling of an element when you're hovered over it. Like for example, why is my mouse cursor not changing when I'm over these buttons, right? Like, this is a button. It should give me some sort of indication that I'm over it. I don't know why it doesn't. So let me see here. How would I do that? I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but there's a hover. Pseudo element is what it's known as, or pseudo class, I guess. And this pseudo class concept will allow me to apply some styling to my element only when I'm hovered over it. Except there's one problem with this, is I can't inline this. I can't inline this pseudo class selector in styling directly on my elements. There's just no way for me to do that. There's literally no syntax that directly supports it. So, well, dang it, that means I can't add some styling here that will only apply when I'm hovered. And that's where, again, that's where this just straight inline styling runs up against its limitation, right? Now we say, oh, let's add some styling when you're hovered. it's going to be, is this right? I don't think it is. Cursor, what are my other options here? Let's see. We can do grab. I mean, it's not really what I want, but all right. So let's see what happens here. Ah, there we go. Now we've got. Let me find the right cursor. I'm bothered by the fact that I don't have the right cursor off the top of my head. What do I want? I wanted pointer. That is what I wanted. All right. Let's check that. There we go. Now we got something that tells us these are clickable, right? Which is awesome, but I had to do it out here in a CSS file. I wasn't able to have it directly inlined on my element because you can't do that with inline styling. So there we have one of our limitations of this, right? With only inline styling, you can't use pseudo class or pseudo element selectors, right? And that's a real limitation. That's a reason that you may want to go with the other approach. But there are tools or frameworks that we can add into our React application. Again, this is getting to the point where I won't dive deep into these because there's just so many. There's so many other ways to do it as well that let us get this sort of inline styling type model where it's all embedded in our component. And yet it'll actually create CSS files that so we can use like pseudo selectors when we need them. So there's a whole family of things that do this. Starting with, I think one of the first ones was Radium, which let's see what we have here. Radium is one of the first ones that sort of lets you inline your styling for React right into it. Oh, look, it tells you they're not really planning to do anymore. So I don't know if it's not being used anymore, but there we go. It lets you support things like browser state styles like hover, active, etc. Probably the most popular one nowadays is what's known as styled components. There's other approaches as well, but this one has gained a ton of traction, and it looks really weird when you first encounter it. I was not comfortable with it when I first encountered it, but it is a powerful way to do some styling. Basically, it creates an extra component that wraps whatever stuff you sort of put into it with their styling. Not going to dive deep into it. If you want to really look at it, you can. But what I'm saying is there's a lot of solutions for the sort of inline problem. So when it comes to styling React applications, I'd say those are the two dominant ways of doing your own styling, right? Is you're either going to be doing these sort of standalone CSS files, but try and bind them to your components, not creating one big generic one. That way you can think of your components as really independent things. Or you're going to be doing some inline styling. And you may do a mix of both, depending on your needs. But React is very flexible and lets you style your applications sort of either one of these ways. And I mean, pros and cons to each approach, I would say. Depends a lot on what you're dealing with. For example, on the last application that I talked about, where we did use classes and some of that stuff, I've come to really regret that decision on that because that application is not actually running on our own web page. we embed those React components into the web pages of libraries. And by using classes and other styling that's very external, it makes it very hard for us to guarantee that our styling will always look the same on every one of these web pages. Because if they have a CSS selector with the same class name, or something that's generic and applies to just all HTML elements, it could affect the way that our components render. Whereas if we had taken all of that and basically created low-level components that were representative of low-level HTML elements and directly styled each one of those, inline styling like that is always going to be more specific than any CSS selector, so we would have very little conflict with the sites that we embed our code in. So it's sort of a trade-off sometimes. You know, it's a decision you might make differently on each different project if you're working on large projects. There's not just one answer in terms of how to accomplish this. All right, I'm going to run down, grab myself a little water or something, and then I'm going to come back up and we can talk a little bit more about what's going on behind the scenes with Create React Apps. So what I'm going to do is, in this clock example, I'm going to go ahead and eject it, and you'll get to see all of the crazy complexity that's going on to be able to build this stuff and what happens to our package.json file once I do that. So I'll be back in just a minute. If you have any questions or other thoughts in the meantime, go ahead and post them. We'll get talking about Webpack in just a moment. All right. If you're still with me, go ahead and say something. Let me know. We'll do a little bit on Webpack, which is sort of crazy. I've worked with it since Webpack 1. It's a nightmare sometimes, and I don't suggest getting down into it unless you have to, because it's not exactly the best documented. It's very powerful, but it's a real challenge to figure out what it's doing and what's going on. But let's get down into it. So if we do npm run again, this is just a way for us to see these different tasks that we can do. Now we've done start. That's where we're running our own web server in the background so that we can develop our React application live. We've done test a little bit just to show that the tests are there and running. And we did build just today, but what we haven't done is eject. And that's because in general, you shouldn't need to eject most of your Create React applications. That's until you start getting into something more complicated or you're doing something different than what they use by default. In this case, though, I really want to show you guys what happens. So let's go back for a second before I do that, and let's take a look at like this package.json file. And you can see here's the React scripts calls. It's got some settings in here. All in all, it's a pretty simple package.json file. It's like 32 lines long. So what about after we do this? This is going to take a little while, and it's going to warn me. Hey, this is dangerous. Are you sure you want to do it? Yes, I do. Oh, wow, that was way faster than it used to be. Oh, it's telling me it's not going to do it. Okay, let me check. Hold on. Added buttons. All right, so now let me check. All right, now I've got my code there. So now let me try and eject. Let's see if it works. There we go. So now you'll see it's actually going and installing some other stuff from NPM. It has all of these added notes here. That's because these are all actually dependencies that existed in our Create React application that we spun up, but they were all hidden from us behind this nice tooling that they've set up for Create React application. All right. Now, let's do an S. This is a list of new files that just got created as a result of this eject, right? Or files that got changed. So let's start by taking a look at this package JSON. Oh my gosh. There's a lot more going on in here than there was before. All right, let's collapse some of these sections and just talk a little bit about some of them. We won't go into all of them. So here's this list of dependencies, right? Which was like 5 long before, but these are actually all the dependencies that exist for this React application. And you'll begin to see stuff that we've talked about. Here's Babel. Here's Webpack. Here's some plugins for Babel to support ESLint and Jest and a loading tool. Oops, I don't want to do that. Here's this camel case. That's being used behind the scenes so that when we camel case stuff here, or we have CSS or something styling, it can convert between stuff like that. I'm not sure which direction it goes, but it's one of those. A CSS loader. These loaders, if I hover over it, you can see the link there. These loaders are Webpack loaders. This is how CSS knows how to load a CSS file when you do import. Because it has a CSS loader that somebody else has written that it uses to say, oh, I see a CSS file or something with .css is its extension. I should use this CSS loader to load that in and create it the way we want. You've seen that linting that's showing up, you know, when I'm typing and it like tries to correct me. Oh, you may want this variable to be named different. That's coming from this ESLint. And then there's a lot of build side stuff too, like file loader or Jest is our testing environment. And now here's the full Webpack along with the Webpack version. So you can see there's a lot of components here, a lot of modules that our application uses that were all hidden from us by that Create React app. You also see we've changed our script section, right? We no longer have eject, but our start is no longer, what was it, React scripts start? Now it's calling node scripts start.js. So it's actually calling this file directly when it runs our local server for development. Now you can go in here and read through this if you want. This is a complicated file. It's pretty ugly. It really is not. Now it's a lot prettier than it used to be. It used to be even worse, but it really is not very pretty code. So, you know, I don't know if you'd get a lot just digging in and reading through that. But what I'm getting at is all of this stuff before was sort of being hidden from us. The Create React app stuff put all this behind a hidden door and just did the work and gave us what we wanted. Now it's all embedded here in this sort of complex, ugly way. What else do we have here? Here's ESLint. This is telling it what configuration we want for linting. This tells it what browsers we support so that it will warn us if we're trying to do something in a non-supported browser. This is a configuration for our test tool, Jest, to say, oh, these are the files, anything with the .js or .jsx or .ts or .tsx, look for those when you're testing. And that's a huge chunk of this. Here's a whole bunch of Jest stuff. So when I collapse that, you can see that a large chunk of this is Jest. And then here's some Babel rules too, telling Babel, how exactly do I take this code that you're giving me and basically compile it into something that the browser actually understands. And then, let me see here, what else did we get created? I'm looking for, there we go, it's in config. So I talked about Webpack. So if we go look at this config folder, here's a Webpack config. This is the actual file that's running, essentially, when it does a build or something. Here you can see it pulling in a lot of these dependencies that I mentioned, like, you know, the, let me find it here. Let me go look over here, our packages real fast to show you. Let's see here. ESLint loader, I should be able to find that, right? Let's see. Oh, there we go. This is where it's loading it. It's a little hidden. It's not exactly clear. So stuff way down there, a whole bunch of stuff up here. This is a big old, wee-hoo. Let me go up to the top here in a second. Again, all of this from line 48 to line 628 is one giant object literal that's providing all of, or I guess it's a function now. That's interesting. They've changed the way it works a little bit. It's all a function. Let me see here. Hold on. Where's my object literal? Here we go. From 120 to 627, this is all an object literal. This is all being set up for the Webpack config for this React application. I have no idea what most of this does. I mean, that's not necessarily true. I've looked at a lot of it, but I don't know what all of it does by a long shot. And so that's one of the reasons I'm sort of highlighting, right? We've got this nice bit of React tooling through Create React App that does a lot of magic for us. And it's just much, much easier if we rely on that where we can versus having to go down in here like I've had to do on both of my projects at work that are leveraging this stuff and figure out, oh, I have to change some of this because we're using a different CSS preprocessor than they support. So I have to go find a plugin and get the right stuff configured and tell it to look for the right files and run in the right case. It's not very pretty. So that's why it's just going to be much easier if you go ahead and stick with the existing stuff. And again, this was a one-way operation for this project. So I can't, I mean, I could check out or just get rid of my current state of my code or whatever since I committed right before this. But if I was trying to move forward from here, I can't go back to having that nice clean Create React app with just the React scripts bits. Instead, I've now got to sort of live in this environment with this ejected bit of Create React app. It's a good question. You shouldn't, the question is, so you wouldn't run eject until your app is basically done and ready to publish. Actually, you don't even need to do it then for the most part. That's what that build step was that we did before, is that allows you to publish your app very nicely. So you only need to run Create React or eject from Create React app if you actually need to do something that they don't already support. So for example, I think that, let me check if that's still true. Less, yeah. So there's some languages, there's some preprocessor things for CSS because CSS files can get very verbose. And so there's some tools that have existed for a long time to let you write stuff more concisely. And the two most popular are Sass and Less. Sass being dramatically more popular than Less. And so you'll see that there's built-in support for Sass as a preprocessor in a Create React app application because it's looking for those file types and running it through the correct tooling. And it's got the Sass loader, but there's no Less loader. Since there's no Less loader, and we were using Less in our existing projects, I had to eject from Create React application and include a Less loader and change, you know, this portion of the configuration that recognized CSS files to be able to support Less as well. I mean, that's one example. Or let's say you use a different test runner than Jest. Then you're probably going to have to eject because you have to configure your test runner. That's one way to say it lets you affect settings that may affect how your app works, yes. It's much more, though, I would say, about how your app builds and what technologies are supported for building it. You remember early on, there was the question about, does Webpack support other languages, right? And that's where I said, yes, you can, because there's a loader for other stuff. Well, let's say the Create React app doesn't automatically support whatever language or version of something that you want to compile down to JavaScript that you're using, but there is a Babel or a React plugin, or so many different tools, a Webpack and or Babel plugin that supports converting from that language to JavaScript, then you'd need to eject and configure that so that you could compile your app correctly. There is stuff around production that's in this, but there's not as much as build time stuff. Again, this is getting really deep, right? Like, what I'm going to tell you is, especially for those of you who are, like, even just the React stuff is quite a challenge right now. Please do not try and dive into any of this. Just avoid it. Just don't even go there. Keep working on what you're doing in React, building out basic JavaScript skills, just practicing that stuff, because this is like really more of a in a real development environment thing. You may have to go down into this, but there are a lot of companies where they never even have to eject from Create React app, and they get to sort of play the nice clean route with what they're building. Yeah, if you wanted to use, you would have to, if you wanted to use less instead of Sass for your styling, you would have to eject from the Create React app. Then you would have to like go find a less loader, for example, like go find the less Webpack loader, import that into your package JSON. So you'd like npm install it, and then you would need to go set up, like this is showing you, oh, here's the portion of the Webpack config that you'd need to set up to have it work, right? Which looks really nice and clean right here. Oh, it's just this little bit of something. But in reality, that little bit of something is embedded somewhere in the middle of all of this. Oh, not this guy. Hold on. Where is my, that's why I'm not seeing what I want right now. Hold on. That's going to be embedded in the middle of this. So let me go find it. See, here's all this Sass stuff. Oh, here's our loaders. Here's our style loader. So you would need to go like figure out how to embed that into this code somewhere, which is not going to be easy. It really isn't. I don't care, unless you're somebody who lives and breathes configuring something like this, it's going to take you hours to days to try and get it all working, because it's just not that easy of a tool, right? Like, so it's real. I would really just encourage you to try and stay on the path that, like, oh, if you're using Create React app, use the technologies that they recommend or that they're already supported by them, unless you have a real compelling reason to do otherwise. It'll make your life a heck of a lot easier. All right, any other questions? Okay, then I think I'm going to get going for tonight. Let me know how the video was. I'm going to try and see. I'll check on it in a few minutes to see if it actually recorded on YouTube the way I want it or not. I only have a few days trial for this app that I'm using right now without paying for it. So I'll probably be switching over to something else. This was just a quick stopgap to try and be able to get streaming tonight successfully. But let me know if there was any issues with audio or video, or the delay was too much, any of that, so that I can consider that as I'm looking at what other options we'll have going forward. Otherwise, I'll talk to you guys later, and let me see if I can figure out how to exit out of this tool. All right, let me see here.